Desde 2019, a Toyota vem acelerando o futuro, produzindo no Brasil o primeiro híbrido flex do mundo. De lá pra cá, as coisas mudaram. Muitos entraram na tendência que a gente criou. Mas sabe o que não mudou? A confiança do brasileiro na Toyota, que não veio da noite pro dia. Toyota, no futuro há muito tempo. Paz no trânsito começa por você.
You know, one of Portland's most frustrating paradoxes is even though we have a strong tradition of progressive politics at both a city and state level, we're still struggling with a ton of social problems. We have high levels of unsheltered homelessness, below average high school graduation rates, and the worst youth mental health services in the country. But why is that the case? Earlier this year, New York Times columnist Kristof raised that very question. As a born and raised Oregonian, he has a unique perspective on how our challenges fit into the national fabric. And his argument is that it's not just Portland pushing progressive agendas with little to no return. He's saying all liberal West Coast cities are facing more social ills than their more pragmatic liberal East Coast counterparts. But that can't be right, can it? So today on CityCast Portland, we're asking Kristof to go in a little further on what he thinks the West Coast challenges mean for progressive politics nationwide. It's Tuesday, September 10th. I'm Claudia Meza, and this is what Portland's talking about. So in your New York Times opinion column for June, what have we liberals done to the West Coast? You lay out that liberal East Coast states like New York, Vermont, Massachusetts are just better at governing and following through with their ideals. You specifically mentioned they have lower levels of unsheltered housing, better public schools, and you very much called out Oregon for ranking dead last for youth mental health services, which we've also discussed on the show. And these comparisons, I just want you to know, did sting, because covering local politics for the past few years, it is frustrating to see so many good, smart people have such great, well-funded intentions and yet somehow not stick the landing. Since you're grouping it all together, what is the liberal East Coast, just in general, doing better in your opinion that's allowing their leaders to stick the landing?
So I think that there has been more focus on evidence-based policy and less on slogans and ideological purity. And I think execution has also been better. Portland in 2004 had announced their 10-year plan to eliminate homelessness. Great. But of course, it didn't actually eliminate homelessness. And I think that too often, and this isn't just a Portland problem, it's not just an Oregon problem. I do think that the problems are fairly analogous in Washington State and in California, where we tend to have a lot of good liberal intentions, full of the right values, but we have focused less on what actually happens. And I think, that it's not an accident that as a result, we fall short. And this isn't a historic pattern because, Portland was in many ways a model of effective government for many years. The Atlantic magazine had a cover story about Portland in 1992 saying, "How does Portland do it?" But I think we maybe became a little bit too full of ourselves, a little bit too captured by purity and not focused enough on metrics.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes I wonder if that is circumstantial in a way, or if that is a narrative given to Portland. I mean, not to say that what you're saying isn't true, because let's just talk about just the critique we hear from the West Coast for unsheltered homelessness when compared to the East Coast. The biggest critique that you'll hear from the West Coast is well, our weather is better. That is a big reason, not only that we have more homelessness, but why the shelter system was never really pushed into place and then it exploded. So what do you say to that?
I think that is an excuse that we tend to make that is just wrong. It probably applies to some degree to San Diego, to Los Angeles. a little less to the Bay Area, but to some degree. But it does not apply to Portland and Seattle, which are two of the cities with the highest days of precipitation in the country. And, look, North Carolina has nice, balmy weather. It doesn't have this kind of problem with homelessness. You have other parts of the country that are likewise have temperate weather and aren't affected by this. I mean, that tends to be an excuse from the left for why we have a lot of unsheltered homelessness. On the right, it tends to be a narrative that is all about drugs and addiction. And, likewise, there is something to that. Drugs are not irrelevant. But the most careful work that has been done by housing economists looks at why some cities have very high rates of homelessness and others don't, suggests that it's not about places with higher addiction. It's not about places with higher weather. It's about two things. It's about the supply of housing, and it's about rents. And, in West Virginia has higher addiction rates than Oregon does, but you can rent a room or an apartment for $650 a month. Try doing that in Portland. Try doing that in Seattle. Try doing that in the Bay Area. And so we have just been really bad about building housing and about making housing relatively inexpensive. This is up and down the West Coast, and in fairness, partly that's our popularity. A lot of people have wanted to move to the West Coast, and particularly the Bay Area and Seattle have been booming and growing, and that raises rents. But there are parts of the country that have also grown a great deal, and they haven't seen the same level of homelessness.
Yeah, that's interesting. Yeah, because it's always about like the unsheltered versus just the regular homelessness when I think about it, because reading your article did make me more curious about just homelessness in general. When I looked at the latest release of the annual homelessness assessment report to Congress, which I'm sure you've seen.
Sure.
And it just followed all of the things that we were just discussing, but they were just picked out two big things. And they said weather and population. Because of course, we're not talking about sheltered. We're just talking about homelessness. It's not, there's no West Coast, East Coast. It's just California has the most people. California is the warmest. New York, which is definitely, again, like you were saying, it's not about warm or whatever, right behind it. Then Florida, Washington, Texas, Oregon. And what I thought was really interesting, because I see when I go to Boston, I look at Boston, I'm like, look, Portland, look what we could have occasionally. Just there's certain things about it. Massachusetts was right below Oregon, just 1,000 people. And none of these things the metrics that we go back and forth with made sense. And so it really is like a sheltered versus unsheltered. And that's what I want to talk to you about. It's like, I think more about like, okay, what are the mechanics that made the East Coast or certain places so good at having this safety net in a sense,
Well, first of all, I think that there is now at least a much better diagnosis of the problem, which is this question of actually building housing supply. So Oregon is short about 120,000 housing units. Given that shortage, you are going to have a vast number of people who are unsheltered. And, there'll be others couch surfing, this kind of thing. And in the past, I think that on the West Coast, we kind of didn't appreciate that. And, there was a famous maybe about a year ago, Willamette Week reported that I think it was the Fairview Apartments in Portland, that they were renovated to create affordable housing at a cost of $1,300 a square foot, which is just ludicrous. I mean, you can gold plate apartments for that much, and they reduced the number of apartments in the Fairview Apartments. So the city of Portland was paying a vast amount of money to reduce the housing supply and aggravate homelessness. And I think that sort of goes to this competence question. And I do think that a lot of it is fundamentally not about good intentions, but about competence. And I look at Dallas and Houston, and both are blue cities, both cared about their homeless problems, both tried to address them. And in Dallas, homelessness got worse. And in Houston, they reduced homelessness by 61%. And fundamentally, in the West Coast, we're Dallas. We try to do the right thing. We want to do the right thing, but we don't have the execution. We don't look at evidence-based policies.
Yeah. I mean, it is known, you pointed out, that liberal states perform better in economic growth, life expectancy, education than conservative ones. So we really are, what I found interesting is it really was a pitting against West Coast, East Coast liberals, which, is always going to ruffle feathers here.
Yeah. Can I give an example of education? Because, so liberal states, as you say, do better on education overall. And, you look at high school graduation rates, pretty strong correlation.
Right.
Likewise, maybe the two states with the best K through 12 education, arguably Massachusetts and New Jersey. Meanwhile, you look at Oregon, our K through 12 outcomes are behind Mississippi's. By every metric, surely all Oregonians, one fundamental liberal value should be giving kids an opportunity to get a good education. Yet the share of kids in pre-K in Oregon is below average. Our NAEP scores have been going down since the end of the 1990s relative to other states. Our college attendance rate is below average. Our college graduation rate is below average. And meanwhile, in Oregon, we have a 38% chronic absenteeism rate in schools. We're the only state that hasn't recovered from the pandemic absenteeism. And the best metric for where a state will be in 30 years is probably its public education system. And we are failing our kids.
All right, well, let's take a quick break here. And when we return, Portland's villain origin story.
Quer desenvolver os talentos da sua equipe e potencializar os resultados da sua empresa? Conte com a expertise do atendimento corporativo do Senac São Paulo, que já capacitou mais de 1 milhão de pessoas e profissionais de instituições públicas, privadas e terceiro setor. Construa uma equipe altamente motivada e capacitada e destaque-se no mercado. Entre em contato, acesse sp.senac.br/corporativo e saiba mais. Quer saber? Senac.
You brought up Portland as like, man, we used to be this city that everyone looked to, and I remember that too, because when I was growing up in LA, we heard about Portland a lot, and it made me want to move here. So why do you think Portland has become a national punching bag? I know you've seen it firsthand working for the paper that elevated us the most and also has been bringing us down the most. I mean, how do you feel that coming from Oregon? You are an Oregonian. Did you defend us, Nick? Why do you think our hero arc went to villain so quickly?
Well, I think one has to acknowledge that we have real problems, and I don't think one should defend failures. And, we have had real policy failures that followed previous policy successes. And I don't think one can walk through downtown Portland today and think this is a triumph of good governance. Oregon has the second highest rate of unsheltered homelessness in the country. I mentioned the 38% chronic absenteeism in Oregon, which is just, astonishing. And so I think that we do have to have a blunt look at where things stand. I don't know. You're in Portland. I'm out in the wilds of Yamhill County, so you're in a better position to judge. But my sense is that in some ways, Portland is improving now. I think that homelessness is somewhat better. The homicide rate is a little bit better than it was last year, and rather better than it was 2 years ago. On the other hand, I think that the economic situation may be worse, and that as commercial leases end in downtown Portland, I think you have more businesses moving to Lake Oswego, to Hillsborough Road, to Beaverton, and I think that is going to mean less tax revenue, and there's going to be cutback in city services as a result. I worry about that kind of downward cycle. I think we've got to face the fact that we've got real challenges in Portland, and the state can't thrive as long as Portland is struggling. And we've got to get a handle on this. And in the long run, education is going to be central to fixing the problems. There clearly were problems with the Portland city government structure. I'm, I think, a little bit skeptical that the new structure is going to solve the problems. And I also wonder to what extent they were as central as some people thought. I think that I really don't know.
So what I'm hearing is you did not defend us, Nick, is what I'm hearing.
Yeah, I wrote it was sort of interesting. I wrote a piece in, I guess it was early 2020, saying that, Portland's got real problems. And then there was actually a bunch of people were very indignant at that piece. But I think that, the piece actually stood up pretty well. I think it's hard to Portland last year had 3 times the homicide rate of New York City. That should not be. And I think our policy measures have been, ineffective. And it's great to have city pride and to cheer successes, but we also have to face the very real challenges we see. And that economic spiral is one that I would really worry about. I'm afraid I'm being a little of a downer for you.
No. You're totally fine. Trust me, you're totally fine. You recently released your memoir, Chasing Hope, A Reporter's Life, where you talk about your life growing up in Yamhill. And in that book, you talk about how many people you grew up with succumbed to drug overdoses and just a general lack of opportunity. We keep honing in on Portland and all that, but Oregon's a big state. Like, do you think Oregon leaders are doing enough balancing the needs of our urban and rural communities?
So I do understand why the governor and others are focused on Portland and the Portland metro area, because the state cannot succeed when its major city is struggling. And tourism in the state struggles when people are nervous about flying into Portland, for example. And so there are genuine reasons for trying to make sure that Portland is as healthy as possible. But that said, you're completely right that we have enormous problems in rural Oregon. And homelessness is not just an urban problem. I mean, we have homelessness among my old friends. There were 2 kids on my old school bus who both appear to have died while homeless in Oregon. One died in McMinnville, and the other was homeless in Medford and has not been heard from in about 5 years. And we think that he lost his life, but we don't really know. And that's, 2 boys on one school bus. I mean, the whole urban-rural divide troubles me. I struggle with because I have one foot in rural Yamhill County and one foot in my kind of international New York Times world. And, I'm a liberal politically, but I'm surrounded by a lot of very good friends who are, very conservative and who will vote for Trump. And the mutual suspicion, I think, impedes good policy making. I do think that it would be helpful if we could try to bridge that divide. And if we could figure out a better business model for rural Oregon. One reason in rural Oregon people want to join Idaho or are suspicious is that, the business model of Lakeview is a prison, a state prison. That's just, of course you're going to have problems when young people can't aspire to much more than working as a prison guard. In Coos Bay on the coast, I mean, the whole coast is struggling too, but there used to be 11 elementary schools in Coos Bay. 9 of them have closed. In Yamhill, jobs went away and meth arrived and people struggled. And I don't think the state or federal authorities did enough to try to address that kind of tragedy that was unfolding in rural as well as urban America.
Do you have any ideas of where Oregon could go to facilitate a better balance of policy that is positively affecting the rural communities and not just, hoping it trickles down?
So my theory about, an economic development opportunity in rural Oregon goes to the fact that, in the past, the environmental battles in this state were essentially between the Willamette Valley, where there were environmentalists, and rural Oregon, where there were loggers. And the environmentalists won that war, those timber wars, and the sawmills shut down. I believe that we were logging very unsustainably. I think that the right side won those timber wars. I also think that we liberals didn't think nearly enough about those communities that lost the sawmills and how to help them. But in any case, I think the environmental wars today are different, and they're not between urban environmentalists on the one side and rural loggers on the other. It's within the environmental community. And the best hope for Lake County, for Harney County, maybe for Coos County, are green energy projects. It's solar and wind in Eastern Oregon. It's offshore wind and maybe in the future waves for the coastal areas. But to make those work, we've got to have transmission capacity and be able to move that energy from the coast or Eastern Oregon to the I-5 corridor. And so on the one hand, you have environmentalists who champion green energy. On the other hand, you have environmentalists who denounce new transmission lines and who make them very, very difficult to build. My view is that climate change is such an urgent issue that we should make it easier to build those transmission lines to have more green energy. And that would also do an awful lot for the coastal economy and for the Eastern Oregon economy. And all these things would create jobs, would give people a reason to stay, and might support those communities.
Yeah, that's to be honest, that's the first time I've heard anyone give an idea that made sense. I always wondered why the coastal towns here, I don't, you've been to California, but coastal towns in California are not impoverished, Right. It's the desirable land. And I always thought it was odd how things were reversed here. That's an interesting thought. Okay, so right now we're talking at the end of August during the DNC. Did you have a chance to see the DNC at all, like the roll call, all of that?
Yeah. I mean, amazing it's such a different attitude today than it was a month ago. There's kind of a joy and an excitement. I should say that it's still going to be a really tight race, and there is still some very real chance that Trump will win.
Would you consider a truce for West Coast, East Coast, just while the vote is coming out, so we could focus all of our liberal powers?
Well, I mean, I'm certainly.
I just want to say West Coast, East Coast. Like, I feel like I grew up in the height of that feud in the 90s, as a teenager. Nick, I'm just extending a West Coast, East Coast liberal truce in the spirit of the DNC.
Well, so, the key choice for the country in the coming months is going to be, who we choose for president. And that's a choice. That's not a referendum. And I'm still going to be writing about problems and trying to hold, I've known Kamala Harris a long time. She's clearly, infinitely better than Trump. But, I'm still going to try to hold Democrats accountable. I care a lot about Gaza, which to me is a complete disaster, and I will continue to write about that and other things. But the big decision for the country in the next couple of months is going to be whether it chooses or whether the people in about 7 different states choose Trump or choose Harris. And I think an awful lot of our future rides on that, and that Trump would be a catastrophe and that Harris would be quite promising.
Mm-hmm. This is the last question. Do you drink wine?
I do.
What's your favorite winery where you live?
Oh, it's ours. We produce wine and cider on our farm. So
sell it to me. Pitch. I want to hear it.
Yeah.
Is it called Kristoff Farms?
So the winery is called Kristoff Farms, and our brand for the wine is Kristoff, and for the cider, it's Kristoff Farms. We have Pinot Noir, Chardonnay, and a Rosé. And people can find out more at KristoffFarms.com. And it's really good stuff. And it's been kind of exciting. It's this effort, my wife and me and our kids. It's a small scale, but it's, in my day job as a columnist, I yell at the world and tell it what to do, and it pays no attention. And on the farm, I can, a vine needs water. I can pour a bucket of water on it and it responds. It listens to me. If the cider is too dry, we can add a little bit and make it a little sweeter, and it listens to me. So it's been this great adventure for us. And, just about everything that could go wrong did. We put a impregnable deer fence around our grapes and apples, and then we discovered we had imprisoned some deer inside our impregnable deer fence with nothing to eat but grapes and apples. But, it's been a wonderful, fun adventure. And at the end of the day, we managed to produce some tremendous wine and cider.
Well, congrats on your endeavor.
Thank you.
Congrats on your book.
Thank you.
Congrats on the book and congrats on the farm. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk with me.
Absolutely. Good to be with you today.
Well, that's all for today here on CityCast Portland. Thanks so much for listening. We'll be back tomorrow morning with more from around the city. Until then, see you at Slim's.